So I'm in the forest on Durland Hill in Chester, and I came upon this skull of a white-tailed deer, and I think we can all agree in AP Environmental that the cycling of nutrients is a topic we'd rather not have to deal with in any detail. And so I just thought of that looking at this skull. There's a nice look at the sutures between the different bones of the cranium, but here you see these scratch marks, and if we roll it over, there might be some better examples on the bottom here and here and here. And what you're seeing is tooth marks from rodents that are gnawing away at these bones that they come across from deer carcasses and other animals, and in that way they're gaining some key nutrients, perhaps calcium, and I don't know if they can metabolize the phosphorus from the material of the skeleton, but you see an example of of nutrient cycling in these gnaw marks. They're not eating the bones for calories to get energy. They're gnawing the bones for the mineral content. Let me share a panorama here. Social distancing and thinking about AP Environmental Science and carbon cycling. So we typically think of forests as carbon sinks, and for the most part that's the right way to think of them. I just want to point out a few things that can make that assumption a little bit complicated, and calculation of carbon in versus carbon out not as straightforward as you might think, not as easily modeled, let's say, with a small scale laboratory experiment. So I'm standing in front of a white ash tree. You can see a woodpecker drilling right there. And some of our stands of trees, this is an extremely common, even dominant species around the area. And that unusual light colored pattern there, you see what's going on there is this tree has been infested by an invasive species, the emerald ash borer, and woodpeckers are scaling off the bark to get to the larvae underneath. This is the distinctive normal appearance of the bark of a white ash tree. So this tree is dead, and so its carbon will be given back to the atmosphere over a period of years as it decomposes, only if it were to be buried in the mud in an anaerobic environment, perhaps sealed away from oxygen, would that carbon maybe eventually get stored in some kind of organic matter, like sort of a peat-like substance, perhaps. You can see this is a bottomland forest, dead trees everywhere. There's lots of what foresters would call coarse woody debris, lots of down trees, and there, along with these dead leaves, some of those dead leaves will be becoming part of the O layer of the soil, the humus, along with some of the matter in those fallen trees. But some of that will also be decomposed and returned to the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. Speaking of the carbon cycle, one of our major impacts on the carbon cycle as a civilization is to burn vast quantities of fossil fuel, which represent millennia of stored carbon from millions and millions, hundreds of millions of years ago, the Carboniferous. And I'm standing here looking across at a pretty large array of solar panels. And this, of course, these are photovoltaic panels, PV cells, similar to ones we've used in the laboratory. And they are angled towards the south at sort of a compromise angle to maximize the amount of solar energy they can capture throughout the year. They're not going to track the sun or tilt and rotate in any way. But the idea is that the direct sunlight is converted to flowing electrons in those solar panels, and at least while the sun is out, that electricity goes out on the grid and reduces the demand for fossil fuels, which have a direct impact on greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. Here's a quick stop on our carbon cycle tour, thinking about carbon cycling and also human impacts. So this is a no-till agriculture cornfield. It hasn't been planted in corn, I believe, for 2 years, but the giveaway is the corn stubble that's been left in place. Had this been plowed for replanting, that would all be turned inside out. You'd see crop furrows. We see some evidence of old crop furrows if we look closely at where the water kind of pools along the rows here. You have to kind of use your imagination. But this type of agriculture, while it results in an increased use of herbicides, without turning the soil inside out by tilling, allows the soil organic matter to build up, and it reduces carbon loss to the atmosphere. The main purpose would be to prevent soil erosion. It's really not an issue in a field like this. It's pretty level and low-lying, but nevertheless, this would be a strategy to reduce soil erosion. I can tell that it's been some time. I'm guessing 2 years. I know it wasn't planted to corn last year, but one of the giveaways that a field is in no-till irrigation, no-till cultivation, is because of the pesticide use. You typically don't see any green in the field except for the crop itself, and often a ring of brown killed grasses and weeds around it. In this field, the green color comes from grass that's just grown up since the field has been left fallow or unworked. So that tells us that the herbicide is broken down and no longer having an active effect on the plants here. Okay, while we're talking about the carbon cycle, I should probably say a word about productivity as well as wetlands. So this is a marsh habitat we're looking at, and I know it's not a big coastal estuary salt marsh, but what you're seeing is wetland dominated by non-woody plants. There are some shrubs mixed in there, but this is primarily cattails, and no big trees, which makes this a marsh as opposed to a swamp. If I just pan around, it's my usual railroad tracks haunt here, and this is a red maple swamp on the other side of the track. So wetland, if you can make out the water in there, and the grass tussocks, and the trees are red maples. We can see them flowering. It's April 1st, and so they're beginning to really show the red color. It's hard to get that light right of their flowers. So these are highly productive ecosystems, which means per square meter they absorb a lot of carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. This marsh is still going to have a winter season. It's still kind of in that winter season now, so it'll be dormant, but on a per square meter basis, the salt marshes along our coastlines are right up there in terms of productivity per area with ecosystems like the tropical rainforests. Here's a little wider look at that marsh habitat, and just to finish the thought about their productivity, a measure of the rate of photosynthesis. This is definitely a carbon sink, no question. They're absorbing more carbon, storing it in the organic mud over long periods of time. I mean, temporarily storing it in their tissues, but habitats like this are very important carbon sinks, which means they absorb more carbon dioxide than they release, averaged out over a year. Here's a lump of coal I picked up along the railroad tracks. Trains aren't actually burning this anymore, but they sometimes carry loads of it, so you find it scattered here and there along the railroad tracks. But historically, this has been a major fossil fuel going back several hundred years on an industrial scale, falling out of favor today because of cost and emissions associated with it. More carbon dioxide per BTU of heat energy emitted by burning coal as compared to, say, an oil product or natural gas, which emits the least of these. They all emit carbon dioxide. This emits the most pollutant per unit of energy gained, and that includes carbon dioxide, but also the principal source of sulfur dioxide, which causes acid rain, and also particulate matter, among other things. Actually, major source of mercury today, even though there's practically no mercury in here. That mercury can fall out downwind, be converted to methyl mercury, and then begin to biomagnify as it enters the food chain and passes from species to species. So just to wrap up by returning to the main idea here, is the forest a carbon source or a carbon sink? And I'm choosing this view because you can see one down tree after another after another. The short answer is almost always going to be yes, the forest is a carbon sink, absorbing, taking more CO2 out of the atmosphere via photosynthesis than it returns through decomposition and other processes. That being said, even though it's April, barely, the canopy still looks like a winter scene. So think of the Keeling curve, that famous graph of the annual cycle of atmospheric carbon dioxide levels hovering around just over 400 parts per million. But every year it goes down in the summer as the leaves come out in the northern hemisphere, which has most of the forests and most of the land. And then in the winter, as those trees go dormant all across the northern hemisphere, photosynthesis slows down dramatically and ceases in some places, and then without the forests absorbing that carbon, the amount in the atmosphere goes even higher. Here's an example, by the way, of some more cycling. Raccoon latrine site at the base of this oak tree, and around those feces you can see the early leaves of spring, trout lilies coming up. So photosynthesis is just getting underway. Some of these wildflowers will take advantage of the open canopy to have their literal moment in the sun, growing, flowering, reproducing before the canopy closes in. So again, source or a sink? It's almost certainly a sink. It's not as simple as it appears to make that calculation, particularly in an older second growth forest like this, where lots and lots of trees have recently fallen, died, fallen, and are actively decomposing. I'll just show you something interesting about our local forest. This is last year's above ground portion of a parasitic plant called squaw root. It's a saprophyte. Here is a close-up of the almost pine cone looking above ground portion. It's a vascular plant. It has, however, no photosynthesis, no chlorophyll, and instead it's extracting all the nutrients it needs from the roots of the oak trees with which it's associated. A parasite, but not a fungus, which it kind of resembles an actual plant parasite on other plants. Here you can see more remnants from last year on the forest floor.